A mail-order bride arrived in Wyoming to marry a widowed rancher. But before her first night ended, she found a letter that could destroy the marriage before it began. It was written by his first wife, hidden inside the family Bible, and addressed to the woman who comes after me. What Clara read next exposed the truth Matthew had buried for years, and if she ignored the warning, she might lose her heart to a man who was still married to a ghost. This is a story about a woman who came west looking for a home, a man who believed love after loss was betrayal, and a little girl afraid that kindness could erase her mother. By the end, one hidden letter will decide whether grief keeps this family apart or finally gives them permission to begin again. The letter beneath the Bible. The year was 1878. The town of Mercy Ridge, Wyoming Territory, was little more than a church, a dry goods store, a blacksmith shed, and a row of weather-beaten homes pressed against the open prairie. People there measured strangers the way they measured storms. Carefully, suspiciously. And when Clara Whitaker stepped down from the train in her brown traveling dress, carrying one carpetbag and a small hat box, every eye at the station seemed to know why she had come. Her gloves were worn thin at the fingertips, but she held that carpetbag like it was the last piece of dignity she owned. A mail-order bride was never just a bride in a town like Mercy Ridge. She was a story before she had a name. Some thought she was desperate. Some thought she was foolish. Some thought she was hiding from something. In Clara's case, they were not entirely wrong. She had come from Missouri after burying both parents within the same year. Her father's debts had taken the farm. Her mother's illness had taken the last of Clara's youth. At 26, she had no money, no brothers, no safe place to belong. But she still had pride. She still had a steady mind. And she had not answered Matthew Hale's marriage notice because she wanted to be rescued. She answered it because she wanted to build something that grief could not steal. His letter had been plain. No poetry, no promises of love, just honest words written in a firm hand. Widower, 34, owns cattle ranch outside Mercy Ridge. One daughter, age 7. Seeking respectable wife able to manage home, teach child, and endure frontier life. I can offer safety, fairness, and a lawful name. I will not offer false romance. Most women would have folded that notice and forgotten it. Clara read it 3 times. There was sadness between the lines, but there was also truth. And after years of men making kind promises they never meant to keep, truth felt like a strong foundation. Matthew Hale was waiting beside the station platform when she arrived. He looked like a man who had learned to speak only when silence no longer protected him. Tall, sun-browned, and quiet, with a black hat in his hands and grief set deep around his eyes. Beside him stood a little girl with dark braids and a face too serious for her age. Matthew did not smile, but he did remove his hat. "Miss Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Hale," Clara answered. The little girl stared at Clara's gloves, then at her face. "This is Ruth," Matthew said. Clara knelt slightly, so she would not tower over the child. "Hello, Ruth." Ruth did not answer. She only moved closer to her father and whispered, "She doesn't look like Mama." A few people nearby heard it. A woman near the depot door lifted her hand to hide a smile. Clara felt the words land in her chest, but she did not let them show. "No," she said gently. "I suppose I do not." It was only a child's whisper. But Clara would soon learn the whole town was thinking the same thing. They were married that same afternoon by Reverend Pike in the small white church at the edge of town. There were no flowers, no wedding breakfast, no music. Only 3 witnesses, a nervous minister, and Ruth sitting in the front pew with her hands folded tight in her lap. When the minister said, "You may kiss your bride," Matthew only bent and kissed Clara's hand. The room went still. Clara felt heat rise in her face. Not because she wanted more from a stranger, but because everyone had seen the truth. This was not a beginning. It was an arrangement. And arrangements could be colder than winter. Matthew's ranch sat 5 miles from town, tucked between low hills and a creek lined with cottonwoods. The cabin was strong, with a stone chimney, 2 bedrooms, a loft, and a porch that faced the sunset. But the moment Clara stepped inside, she felt it. The house did not feel empty. It felt occupied by a memory no one had asked to leave. A blue shawl hung on a peg by the bedroom door. A woman's sewing basket sat beside the hearth, untouched. On the mantel was a small painted portrait of Lydia Hale, Matthew's first wife. She was fair-haired, soft-eyed, and smiling in a way that made the whole room feel loyal to her. Nothing in the room accused Clara, and somehow, that made it worse. Matthew carried her bag inside and set it near the smaller bedroom. "You'll sleep here," he said. "And you?" "In the loft for now." The words were respectful, but they cut. "For now," Clara repeated. Matthew did not meet her eyes. "It is best." That night, after Ruth had gone to bed and Matthew had disappeared to check the animals, Clara tried to make peace with the silence. She unpacked her few dresses. She placed her mother's hair comb on the small washstand. Then, looking for paper to write to the woman who had arranged her travel west, Clara opened the family Bible on the table. She did not know it yet, but the answer to every cold silence in that house was waiting between those pages. That was when she found the letter. The blue ribbon was faded nearly gray. The paper had yellowed at the edges, and the first words seemed to breathe from the page. "To the woman who comes after me." Clara's heart began to beat faster. "I do not know your name. I do not know if you are kind. I do not know if you will love my husband or only need a roof. But I know you will live in my house, touch my things, and hear my child speak of me." The room seemed to shrink around her. "If Matthew has brought you here, then I am gone. And he has finally admitted he cannot raise Ruth alone. But do not mistake need for love. My husband is a good man, but grief can make a good man unfair." Outside, a barn door creaked in the wind. She wanted to stop reading. Instead, she turned the page. But only half the letter was there. The rest had been torn away. The final line on the torn page read, "If he has not given you his whole heart, do not let him take yours." Clara sat frozen at the table. Those words felt less like a warning and more like a hand placed firmly against her chest. When Matthew came in, he found her holding the letter. For the first time since she had met him, his calm face broke. "Where did you get that?" "It was in the Bible." He crossed the room and took it from her hand. Not roughly, but with fear. "You had no right." Clara stood. "No right." It was addressed to the woman who came after her. His face went pale. "You should not have read it." "Maybe not," Clara said. "But maybe you should have." Matthew looked at the torn paper, then away. For a moment, she thought he might explain. Instead, he folded the letter, tied the ribbon, and placed it back in the Bible. "That letter is old," he said. "So is your grief," Clara answered softly. "But both are still in this room." Matthew said nothing, and the silence that followed was colder than any answer. Clara had come west expecting hardship, but she had not expected a dead woman to speak to her on her wedding night. And the first thing Lydia's letter gave her was not comfort. It was a warning, a house still married to a ghost. By morning, Clara had made biscuits, fried salt pork, and warmed coffee before Matthew came in from the barn. Ruth sat at the table but did not eat. She kept staring at Clara as if waiting for her to do something wrong. Finally, the child said, "Mama made better biscuits." Matthew set his cup down. "Ruth." But Clara lifted a hand. "She probably did." Ruth blinked. Clara slid the plate closer. "I never claimed to make the best biscuits in Wyoming." "You're not mad." "No. Mama used honey." "Then tomorrow," Clara said, "you can show me how she did it." Ruth looked down at her plate. It was not a smile, but it was not rejection either. For the next few weeks, Clara worked hard. She rose before dawn. She mended shirts, scrubbed floors, gathered eggs, and taught Ruth her letters at the kitchen table. She learned which cow kicked, which window stuck, and which corner of the roof leaked when rain came from the west. But there were rules in that house no one had spoken aloud. Do not move Lydia's shawl. Do not use Lydia's cup. Do not ask Matthew about the locked trunk at the foot of his bed. Do not speak of the torn letter. And never sit in the second chair on the porch. That chair had belonged to Lydia. Every evening Matthew sat outside after supper, staring toward the hills. The second chair stayed empty beside him, silvered by dust and moonlight. One night, Clara carried a cup of coffee to the porch. Matthew looked up. "Thank you." She glanced at the empty chair. "May I sit?" His hand tightened around the cup. It was only a small movement, but Clara saw it. She nodded once, as if he had spoken aloud. "Good night, Matthew." She went back inside and closed the door gently. That night, she cried for the first time since coming west. Not loudly, not like a helpless woman, but quietly, with her hand over her mouth, because she had promised herself she would not break in a house that already had too many broken things. She did not cry because she was weak. She cried because even strong women need one dark room where they do not have to pretend. By then, Clara understood the truth. She was not fighting another woman for Matthew's heart. She was fighting the guilt that had locked his heart away. The town calls her a replacement. The town noticed everything. By the end of Clara's first month, people had begun to talk. At the dry goods store, Mrs. Bell, the blacksmith's wife, looked Clara up and down and said, "Must be strange wearing another woman's life." Clara held a sack of flour against her hip. "I wear my own life, ma'am." Mrs. Bell smiled thinly. For now, Ruth heard. On the ride home, the child was quiet. Then she asked, "Are you trying to be my mama?" Clara pulled the wagon reins gently. "No." "Then why did you marry Papa?" Clara could have said many things. For shelter, for survival, for a lawful place in a hard world. But children deserved simple truth. "Because I was lonely," Clara said. "And I think your father was too." Ruth frowned. "Papa doesn't get lonely." Clara looked out at the wide, empty land. Some people get so lonely they forget what it feels like to need someone. That evening, Ruth asked Clara to show her how to stitch a straight seam. It was the first gift the child gave her. A question. If you were Clara, would you have stayed after reading those words? Or would you have packed your bag before sunrise? Keep that thought. The harder test is still ahead. The town had already judged Clara. Ruth still did not trust her, and Matthew was still afraid to need her. But before the night was over, all three would see what kind of woman had really come to Mercy Ridge. 3 nights later, a storm rolled down from the mountains with hard rain and a wind that shook the cabin walls. Matthew was away checking cattle near the north pasture. Clara had just banked the fire when she heard a sound from the barn. A sharp crack, then the scream of a horse. She grabbed Matthew's coat, pulled on boots, and ran into the rain. Inside the barn, a lantern had fallen and shattered. Fire crawled through the straw near the feed sacks. The horses kicked in terror. Clara did not wait for Matthew. She beat at the flames with a wet saddle blanket, coughing through the smoke, her hair coming loose around her face. Ruth appeared at the barn door in her nightdress. "Stay back," Clara shouted. But the little girl saw her pony pulling against its rope and ran forward. A beam groaned overhead. Clara dropped the blanket and lunged for Ruth, dragging her back just as a burning shelf crashed down where the child had been standing. When Matthew rode in minutes later, he found Clara soaked, coughing, and still fighting the flames with both hands blistered from heat. He leapt from the horse and helped her smother the last of it. When it was over, Ruth clung to Clara's skirt, sobbing. Matthew stood in the smoking barn and stared at Clara's burned palms. "You could have been killed," he said. "So could your daughter." His voice broke on the next words. "Our daughter." Clara looked at him. Matthew looked just as startled as she did. Ruth stopped crying. The storm beat against the roof. And for one small moment, the dead house seemed to take a breath. What Lydia really wanted. The next morning, Clara woke to find Matthew sitting beside the kitchen stove, waiting with a basin of cool water and clean cloths. He did not speak much as he bandaged her hands, but his hands were rough from rope and winter work, and for Clara, he moved like he was afraid one careless touch might cost him the only chance he had left. "I should have been here," he said. "You were doing your work." "My work is not only cattle." Clara watched his face. "No," she said, "it is not." He finished wrapping her hand, then reached into his shirt pocket. The faded blue ribbon lay across his palm. "The letter. I read it again last night," he said. Clara's breath caught. "All of it." Matthew shook his head. "I only have the half you saw. Where is the rest?" "I don't know." For the first time, his eyes filled with something close to shame. "After Lydia died, I found the letter. I read the first page and could not bear the rest. I tore it without knowing what I was doing. I thought I had destroyed the second half. Why keep the first half? Because it was the last thing she wrote." He looked toward Lydia's portrait. I have been holding on to her handwriting because I could not hold on to her. Clara wanted to be angry. Part of her was. But another part understood grief too well to judge it quickly. She knew me better than I knew myself, Matthew said. She warned you about me. She warned me not to give my heart to a man who would not give his whole heart back. Matthew closed his eyes. I have no right to ask for yours. No, Clara said. Not yet. That answer hurt him. But he accepted it. And because he accepted it, Clara respected him more. Before the rest of Lydia's letter is read, ask yourself this. Was it a warning meant to send Clara away, or a blessing hidden inside pain? The missing half of the letter was found 3 days later by Ruth. Clara had asked her to bring down old linens from the trunk in the loft. Ruth returned with a small bundle wrapped in Lydia's blue shawl. Inside was a baby dress, a lock of hair, and a folded piece of yellowed paper. Ruth held it out with both hands. It has Mama's writing. Matthew went still. Clara did not reach for it. This was not hers to take. Matthew held the torn paper like it might burn him. If Lydia's last words condemned him, he would lose Clara before he had truly found her. But if those words forgave him, then the hardest choice of his life would still remain. He would have to decide whether to keep worshiping the past or finally step into the life Lydia had prayed he would live. His face changed as he read. Then he sat down as if his legs had failed him. Ruth began to cry before she knew why. What does it say? Clara asked quietly. Matthew could not answer. So he handed the paper to Clara. Her bandaged fingers shook as she read the missing words aloud. But if he tries, dear stranger, if he truly tries, then be patient with him. Matthew loves like the land out here. Quiet on the surface, deep underneath, and slow to show its green after winter. Clara's voice broke, but she continued. Do not let my memory become a locked door in my own house. Open the windows. Move the chairs. Teach Ruth that a heart can love her mother and still make room for another woman's kindness. Matthew covered his mouth with one hand. Ruth leaned against his knee. Clara, read the final lines. And Matthew, if you are the one reading this, then listen to me one last time. You are not betraying me by living. You are only wasting my love if you refuse to use what it gave you. Marry again, if you must. Love again, if you can. And when she comes, do not make her stand outside the life I prayed you would keep. The cabin was silent except for the wind. Matthew bowed his head. For 3 years, he had believed grief was loyalty. But Lydia had called it waste. For 3 years, Matthew thought Lydia's memory was asking him to stay faithful to sorrow. But her final words asked something harder. They asked him to live. The letter comes home. That night, Matthew took the blue shawl from the peg by the bedroom door. He held it for a long moment. Then he folded it carefully and placed it inside the trunk with the baby dress and the lock of hair. Not thrown away. Not forgotten. Placed. Honored. At supper, Ruth watched him with wide eyes. Matthew looked at Clara. Would you sit on the porch with me tonight? Clara did not answer right away. The old hurt in her chest told her to be careful. But the letter lay open on the table between them, and somehow it felt less like a ghost now and more like a hand guiding them forward. Yes, she said. I will. That evening, Clara sat in the second chair. Matthew did not flinch. Ruth sat on the porch steps, leaning against Clara's skirt, while the sky burned orange over the hills. No one spoke for a while. Then Ruth whispered, If I love Clara, will Mama be sad? Matthew's breath caught. Clara looked at the child, but she let Matthew answer. No, he said, his voice rough. I think your Mama would be glad. Ruth turned and looked up at Clara. Could I call you Clara for now? Clara smiled softly. For as long as you need. It was not the word mother, but it was trust. And trust was the first plank in any home worth building. Spring came slowly to Mercy Ridge. The creek rose. The cottonwoods budded. Calves began to stumble through the pasture on unsteady legs. And in the Hale cabin, small things changed. Clara's comb stayed on the washstand. Her blue work dress hung beside Matthew's coat. Her laughter came easier when Ruth spilled flour or Matthew burned coffee trying to help. At church, Mrs. Bell still watched them with sharp eyes. But one Sunday, when she said, I suppose some men can replace anything if given enough time, Matthew turned in front of half the congregation. My first wife was not replaced, he said calmly. She was loved. Clara is not a replacement either. She is my wife. The church fell silent. Clara felt every eye move toward her. For once, Matthew did not hide behind quiet. He stood beside her openly. And in that moment, the town lost some of its power. The final test came in late April, when Ruth fell ill with fever. It began with a cough. By nightfall, she was burning hot and calling for her mother. Matthew rode for the doctor through mud and darkness, while Clara stayed behind, cooling Ruth's forehead, changing cloths, whispering gentle words when the child cried. Near midnight, Ruth opened her eyes and reached weakly. "Mama." Clara froze. She would not steal that name from a fevered child. "I'm here, Ruth," she whispered. "It's Clara." Ruth's fingers closed around hers. "Don't go." "I won't." For 2 days, Clara did not leave the child's side. When Matthew returned with the doctor, he found her still awake, pale with worry. The doctor did what he could. Then he told them to wait. Waiting was the cruelest work on the frontier. By dawn, Ruth's fever broke. She opened her eyes and saw Clara sleeping in the chair beside her bed. The child reached out and touched Clara's sleeve. "Clara." Clara woke at once. "Yes, sweetheart." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "I think Mama sent you." Clara covered the child's hand with her own. "No," she whispered. "I think she made room for me." Matthew stood in the doorway and wept without sound. What would you call Clara at this point? A second wife, a stepmother, or the woman brave enough to make a broken house warm again? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to know what you think. A week later, after Ruth was strong enough to sit at the table, Matthew brought out the family Bible. The hidden letter lay beside it. Both halves. The torn edges matched like a wound that had finally been cleaned. Matthew looked at Clara. "I don't want it hidden anymore." The same letter that almost drove Clara from the house was now lying open between them. And this time, no one reached to hide it. Together, they placed Lydia's letter between the Bible pages, not buried deep where no one would find it, but at the front, beside the family names. Matthew wrote first. Matthew Hale, husband to Lydia, father to Ruth. Then, with a steady hand, he added, Matthew Hale, husband to Clara, given mercy enough to love twice. Clara's eyes filled. Ruth leaned over the table. "Can I write something?" Matthew handed her the pencil. In careful, uneven letters, Ruth wrote, "My mama loved us first." Clara stayed. Clara pressed a hand to her mouth. "Is that all right?" Ruth asked. Clara bent and kissed her hair. "That is more than all right." The letter that began as a secret became the first honest page of their new life. It no longer stood between Clara and Lydia. It no longer accused Matthew. It no longer made Ruth choose between the mother she lost and the woman who stayed. Tied with its faded blue ribbon, the letter rested beneath their names, not as a warning anymore, but as a blessing. That summer, the second chair on the porch no longer sat empty. Sometimes Clara sat there with mending in her lap. Sometimes Ruth curled in it with a book. Sometimes Matthew rested his hand on the back of it while he spoke of cattle, rain, and small plans for the future. The portrait of Lydia still remained on the mantel. But now, beside it, stood a pressed wildflower Ruth had picked for Clara. The house had not forgotten. It had changed. And there is a great difference between the two. On the first anniversary of Clara's arrival, Matthew asked her to walk with him to the cottonwoods by the creek. He was nervous, though they had been married a year. That made Clara smile. From his pocket, he took the faded blue ribbon that had once tied Lydia's hidden letter. Inside were only 7 words. "Thank you for making our house warm." Clara held the paper to her heart. Matthew stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder. And the family Bible lay open nearby, its pages moving softly in the summer air. The hidden letter was still there, but it was hidden no longer. It had done what Lydia meant it to do. It had warned. It had wounded. It had opened. And finally, it had blessed. Clara Whitaker had come west believing she was entering another woman's shadow. But in that quiet ranch house outside Mercy Ridge, she learned that love is not a room with space for only one memory. It is a home. And when grief is finally given a chair by the fire, it no longer has to stand in the doorway. That night, as the sun dropped behind the Wyoming hills, Clara sat in the second chair on the porch. Matthew sat beside her. Ruth leaned against them both. And inside the family Bible, tied with a faded blue ribbon, the letter rested beneath their names. No longer a secret, no longer a warning, but the first blessing of a family that had learned how to begin again. If this story touched your heart, tell me in the comments what Lydia's letter meant to you. A warning, a blessing, or both. And if you carry a love for quiet frontier stories about lonely hearts finding home again, there is another letter, another promise, another forgotten memory waiting for you in this collection. Come back whenever the world feels too loud. The Old West will be here,